Chapter 1: The Breakthrough. In the cold, sterile halls of the Black Star Research Facility, the hum of machinery and the soft murmurs of scientists filled the air. Buried deep beneath the frozen Antarctic wasteland, this top-secret military laboratory had become the epicenter of humanity's most ambitious project. Project Black Star was the culmination of decades of research, the answer to humanity's growing need for survival beyond Earth. With dwindling resources and the rising threat of extraterrestrial hazards, the need for a new kind of soldier had never been more urgent. The facility's lead scientists had been tasked with creating something extraordinary, something that could adapt to any environment, regenerate from any injury, and outlast the harshest conditions imaginable. They had worked tirelessly, mixing genes from various species, experimenting with nanotechnology, and pushing the limits of bioengineering. Their creation, the creature they called Genesis, was a marvel of modern science, an organism that had the potential to change the course of human history. Genesis was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was not just a creature, it was a living, evolving entity, able to adapt to its surroundings in real time. Its body was a fluid mass of cells, constantly regenerating and altering its structure to suit its environment. The team had never encountered anything so complex, and yet they had no idea of the dangers lurking within their creation. The creature's ability to integrate DNA from any organism it came into contact with fascinated the scientists. They marveled at its rapid evolution, how it could heal almost instantly from even the most grievous wounds. Each time Genesis encountered a new substance, it absorbed and adapted, becoming stronger, more resilient. It was designed for space exploration, intended to survive on hostile planets and endure extreme conditions that would kill any human. But as the team celebrated their breakthrough, they failed to notice the subtle changes in Genesis's behavior. Dr. Laura Hayes, one of the project's lead geneticists, had been part of the team since the beginning. She was a brilliant scientist, known for her groundbreaking work in gene manipulation, and she had been instrumental in the development of Genesis. For months, she had worked closely with the creature, monitoring its growth and evolution, observing how it adapted to the increasingly hostile conditions they subjected it to. But as Genesis grew, so did her unease. There were times when she would catch Genesis staring at her, its amorphous form shifting and pulsing as if it were studying her just as intently as she was studying it. Its movements, once random and chaotic, began to show a disturbing level of coordination. It would mimic her actions, mirroring the tilt of her head or the movement of her hands. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, a byproduct of its adaptive nature. But as the days went on, the creature's behavior became more deliberate, more purposeful. It was learning. Despite her growing concerns, the project pressed on. The military was eager to see results, and the pressure on the team was immense. They were running tests around the clock, pushing Genesis to its limits, unaware that they were on the verge of a catastrophic failure. Hayes voiced her concerns to her colleagues, but her warnings were drowned out by the excitement of their apparent success. No one wanted to believe that their greatest achievement could be a threat. Then, one night, the unimaginable happened. The lab was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the soft, rhythmic beeping of machines monitoring Genesis's vitals. The creature rested in its containment chamber, a massive, reinforced enclosure designed to withstand anything it might throw at them. Hayes stood in front of the glass, watching as the creature's form rippled and shifted, its liquid-like body constantly in motion. She had been up for over 20 hours, unable to shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She studied the readouts on her tablet, scanning the data for any anomalies, but everything seemed normal. Genesis was stable. The containment protocols were in place, and there were no signs of instability. And yet, something gnawed at the back of her mind. Suddenly, the alarms blared, a deafening wail that echoed through the lab. Hayes's heart leaped into her throat as she whipped around to face the control panel. Red lights flashed across the room, and a warning message appeared on her tablet: containment breach. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to the control console, her fingers flying over the keys as she tried to assess the situation. The containment chamber had been compromised. a tiny crack in the reinforced glass, allowing a small amount of Genesis's fluid form to seep out. It was barely visible, just a droplet at first, but that was all it took. Before Hayes could react, the droplet slid down the glass and into the ventilation system. Her blood ran cold as she realized what had happened. Genesis had escaped containment, and it was already spreading. Hayes slammed her hand on the emergency shutdown button, sealing the lab and initiating the lockdown protocols. But it was too late. The creature's essence had infiltrated the vents, dispersing throughout the facility. The containment breach had set off a chain reaction, one that no one could have anticipated. She ran to the intercom, her voice shaking as she tried to alert the rest of the team. "This is Dr. Hayes. We have a containment breach. Genesis is loose. Lock down all access points and get to the safe rooms immediately." But as she spoke, she could hear the commotion in the hallways. People were shouting, the sound of footsteps echoing through the metal corridors as the facility's staff scrambled to respond to the emergency. She could hear the lab doors slamming shut as the automatic lockdown system kicked in, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. Genesis had already spread. Hayes grabbed her tablet and raced toward the lab's exit, her mind racing with possibilities. How had this happened? The containment chamber was supposed to be impenetrable, designed to withstand even the most extreme conditions. And yet Genesis had found a way out. It had evolved. As she ran through the sterile corridors, the lights flickered ominously, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The facility, once a beacon of cutting-edge science, now felt like a tomb. The air was heavy with tension, and Hayes could feel the weight of her own breath in her chest. She passed by several of her colleagues, their faces pale with fear as they hurried toward the safe rooms. But even as they rushed to safety, Hayes knew it was only a matter of time before the infection reached them. Genesis wasn't just a creature. It was a virus, a living, adaptive organism that could integrate with anything it touched. It had already started to infect the facility's systems, its essence spreading like wildfire through the air ducts, attaching itself to the very fabric of the building. Hayes skidded to a halt outside one of the lab's secondary control rooms, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly entered her access code, the door hissing open as she stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the glow from the computer monitors casting an eerie light over the consoles. She quickly pulled up the facility's internal security feed, her eyes scanning the screens as she watched the events unfold. Her worst fears were confirmed. The infected staff were already beginning to change. Their movements became sluggish, their skin paling to an unnatural hue as the virus took hold. Their eyes glazed over, their expressions vacant and hollow. Hayes's hands trembled as she realized the full extent of the disaster. Genesis was no longer confined to a single form. It had become airborne, infiltrating the bodies of the facility's staff and turning them into something else, something inhuman. She watched in horror as one of the security guards collapsed on the floor, his body convulsing violently before stilling. When he stood again, he was no longer the man she had known. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though his muscles were no longer his own. He looked up at the camera, his eyes dead and lifeless, and yet there was something behind them, something hungry. The infection was spreading faster than she had anticipated. Genesis had already taken control of the facility's ventilation system, using it to disperse its essence throughout the building. Hayes knew it wouldn't stop there. The creature's ability to adapt meant that it could continue to evolve, finding new ways to spread beyond the facility's walls. She had to act quickly. The only chance they had of containing the outbreak was to destroy the facility and hope that it would be enough to stop Genesis before it could spread to the rest of the world. But as she stared at the security feeds, watching her colleagues succumb to the infection one by one, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. Chapter 2. The Infection. The bitter cold winds howled over the Antarctic landscape, a vast and desolate expanse that seemed even more foreboding as the chaos unfolded within the hidden facility buried deep beneath the ice. Dr. Laura Hayes watched in horrified disbelief as the security footage displayed the first signs of the infection spreading. Genesis had turned the once bustling lab into a nightmare. The transformation was swift and grotesque. It had barely been an hour since the containment breach, and already the corridors of Blackstar were crawling with what remained of her colleagues. The infected staff, once the brightest minds in their fields, now moved with eerie sluggishness, as if their bodies were no longer their own. Hayes couldn't help but notice the strange fluidity in their movements, almost as though Genesis was still adapting, figuring out how to best utilize its new hosts. She had witnessed many terrible things in her career, but nothing had prepared her for this. People who only moments ago had been working alongside her, now reduced to hollow shells, their eyes vacant and without humanity. As Hayes stood in the control room, her hands shaking on the console, she realized the enormity of the situation. The infection was not contained. Worse still, it was becoming clear that Genesis was far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. What was supposed to be a groundbreaking achievement in adaptive biology had turned into a catastrophic plague, and now it was spreading like wildfire, feeding on the bodies of the infected and evolving with each new host. The doors of the control room slid open with a hiss, startling Hayes out of her thoughts. Sergeant Marcus Rivers, leader of the facility's security team, rushed in, his face pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. His uniform was torn, smeared with blood, but he moved with the unyielding precision of a man who had seen his share of combat. Behind him trailed a handful of soldiers, their faces hard with fear and adrenaline. "We're losing control, Dr. Hayes," Rivers said, his voice low and urgent. "We've sealed off as many sections as we could, but the infection is spreading faster than we can manage. It's already in the air ducts. We're running out of time." Hayes felt a surge of guilt twist in her stomach. She had been part of the team that created Genesis, part of the project that had brought this horror to life. She hadn't known, of course, none of them had, but that knowledge didn't absolve her of responsibility. The weight of what they had unleashed was crushing her, but there was no time to dwell on regret. She had to think, and fast. "There's no containing it," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's too late for that. The only option left is to shut down the facility completely. We need to initiate the failsafe and destroy everything." Rivers frowned, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. "Destroy the entire facility? Do we have any other options?" "No," Hayes said. "The infection is airborne now. Even if we seal off every access point, it will find a way out. It's evolving, and it's intelligent. Genesis is using the infected to spread faster. It's not just a virus. It's a living organism, and it's adapting too quickly for us to stop it through normal means. If it reaches the surface, there's no telling how far it could spread." Rivers nodded grimly. He knew what this meant. Shutting down the facility's systems and triggering the failsafe would mean wiping out everyone left inside, including his own men, but there was no room for hesitation. The alternative was worse, far worse. "How do we initiate the failsafe?" Rivers asked, his tone all business now. "We'll need to access the main reactor core," Hayes explained. "It's deep in the lower levels, and I'm not sure how far the infection has spread down there. We'll have to move quickly. Once the core is destabilized, it will cause a meltdown that will obliterate the entire facility. Nothing will survive, not even Genesis." Rivers straightened, turning to his team. "We move out now. Keep your weapons ready and stay sharp. We have no idea what we'll face down there." The soldiers nodded in grim unison, their expressions hardening. Hayes could see the fear in their eyes, but it was overshadowed by determination. These were trained soldiers, used to danger, but nothing in their training had prepared them for this. As they exited the control room, weapons at the ready, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the empty corridor, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had descended over the once bustling facility. The group moved quickly, Hayes in the center, Rivers at the front. The halls were lit only by the emergency lights now, casting everything in a red, pulsing glow that made the shadows seem to move on their own. Every corner they turned felt like it might be their last, as though the infected were just waiting, hiding in the dark, ready to pounce. As they descended deeper into the lower levels of the facility, Hayes' heart raced with fear and adrenaline. The farther they went, the more apparent it became that the infection had taken hold everywhere. The walls were smeared with blood, and bodies lay strewn across the floor, twisted in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. The stench of death hung thick in the air, mixing with the strange organic odor that Genesis exuded, a smell like rotting earth and decay. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the corridor ahead. The soldiers immediately raised their weapons, forming a defensive line in front of Hayes. Rivers motioned for silence, and they moved cautiously forward, their footsteps muffled against the hard metal floor. The sound grew louder, more distinct as they rounded the corner. There, in the dim light, they saw it, one of the infected. It was hunched over, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles as it shuffled slowly down the corridor. Its skin was pale and translucent, veins bulging beneath the surface, and its eyes were glazed over, milky and lifeless. Rivers signaled to his team, and without a word, they opened fire. The bullets tore through the infected's body, but it didn't fall. Instead, it stumbled backward, its body twitching and jerking as it tried to stay upright. Genesis had made it stronger, more resilient. Even as they unloaded round after round, the creature kept moving, its movements erratic and jerky, but unrelenting. Finally, with a sickening lurch, the infected collapsed to the floor, its body still twitching as it lay in a pool of its own blood. The soldiers remained tense, their weapons still trained on the corpse, waiting to see if it would rise again. After a few moments of stillness, Rivers motioned for them to move forward. "They're getting harder to kill," one of the soldiers muttered, his voice barely audible beneath his breath. Hayes swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew exactly what that meant. Genesis was evolving. It was learning how to survive, how to make its hosts more durable, more difficult to destroy. And the longer they waited, the stronger it would become. As they pressed on, the tension grew thicker, every shadow, every sound making their nerves jangle. The lower levels were even worse than the upper ones. The infection had taken hold here more fully. The walls pulsed with an unsettling organic texture, as though Genesis had begun merging with the facility itself. Strange growths, dark, fleshy masses, protruded from the metal, oozing a viscous fluid that dripped onto the floor. Hayes couldn't help but gag at the sight of it. It was as if the facility was being consumed, transformed into something monstrous. Finally, after what felt like hours of navigating the labyrinthine corridors, they reached the reactor core. The door to the reactor room was large and imposing, its surface covered in warning signs. Rivers approached the control panel and keyed in the access code. The door hissed open with a deep groan, revealing the massive reactor housed within. But something was wrong. Hayes's breath caught in her throat as she saw the reactor. It had been overtaken by the infection. Genesis had spread here too. The reactor, once pristine and metallic, was now covered in the same organic growths they had seen throughout the lower levels. Vines of fleshy tissue wound around the machinery, pulsing with life. The infection was everywhere. "It's worse than I thought," Hayes whispered, her voice shaking. "We have to trigger the meltdown manually. There's no way the system will respond to standard commands." Rivers nodded grimly. "Do whatever you have to do, but make it fast." Hayes approached the console, her fingers flying over the keys as she bypassed the corrupted systems and initiated the manual override. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, versus the knowledge that this was their last chance. If they failed here, Genesis would spread unchecked. The world outside would fall just as easily as the facility had. The reactor hummed, the sound growing louder as the core began to destabilize. Alarms blared, the lights flashing red, signaling the impending meltdown. But as Hayes worked, she heard it, a low guttural growl. It was close, too close. She turned just in time to see the infected pouring into the reactor room, their bodies moving with unnatural speed, their eyes locked on her. The soldiers opened fire, the deafening sound of gunfire filling the room. But Hayes knew it wouldn't be enough. The infected were stronger now, more coordinated. Genesis was adapting, and time was running out. Chapter 3. The Evolving Threat. The sound of gunfire ricocheted off the cold, metallic walls of the reactor room, but Dr. Laura Hayes barely heard it. Her heart pounded in her chest as her hands flew across the console, trying to finish the manual override before it was too late. She could hear the infected rushing toward them, the frantic shouts of the soldiers as they tried to hold the creatures back. Time was slipping away, and Genesis was still evolving. The reactor room was bathed in red, the emergency lights casting an eerie glow over the organic growths that had consumed the walls and machinery. The infection was everywhere now, spreading like a living virus that pulsed and throbbed with unnatural life. It had fused with the facility, turning what was once a place of scientific discovery into a grotesque, living nightmare. Sergeant Marcus Rivers barked orders to his team, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of gunfire and growls. The soldiers fought with everything they had, their weapons blazing, but the infected were relentless. They moved with a strange, jerky coordination, their bodies twisted and grotesque, yet terrifyingly resilient. No matter how many rounds they fired, the creatures kept coming, shrugging off wounds that should have killed them. Rivers took down one of the infected, a former lab technician whose face had melted into something unrecognizable. The creature's limbs twitched and jerked as it hit the ground, but almost immediately it started to rise again, its muscles contorting and snapping into place like a puppet on strings. Rivers cursed under his breath, realizing just how little time they had left. He fired another round, this time into its head, and the thing finally went limp. "They just keep getting back up," one of the soldiers shouted, his voice strained with panic. "We can't hold them off forever." Hayes didn't need to hear that to know it was true. She could feel it, the sheer inevitability of Genesis's relentless advance. The infection was unstoppable, spreading faster than anyone had thought possible, adapting to every countermeasure they threw at it. The infected were no longer human, but something far worse, something that could not be reasoned with, could not be stopped by normal means. Genesis had made them into vessels of its will, hollow shells driven by its singular, insatiable need to spread and consume. Sweat dripped down Hayes's forehead as she worked, her fingers trembling with the weight of the situation. She knew the consequences of failure, knew that if they didn't initiate the reactor meltdown, the infection would find a way out of the facility, and from there, it would be unstoppable. The world wasn't prepared for something like this. Genesis wasn't just a virus, it was an entity, constantly evolving, learning, adapting. If it reached the surface, it would spread across the globe in days, maybe even hours. There would be no cure, no escape. Humanity would fall. "I've almost got it," she muttered to herself, trying to stay focused as the sounds of the battle raged behind her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the room. Hayes's head snapped up just in time to see one of the infected, this one a towering mass of muscle and sinew, smash through the barricade the soldiers had hastily erected. Its arms were unnaturally long, its fingers clawed and twitching as it barreled toward them with terrifying speed. Rivers and his team opened fire, but the creature barely slowed. Bullets ripped through its flesh, but Genesis had made it stronger, much stronger. It shrugged off the gunfire, its movements fueled by an unnatural energy. "Hayes, we need that meltdown now," Rivers shouted, his voice edged with desperation as he emptied his clip into the advancing creature. Hayes didn't respond. There was no time. She returned her focus to the console, frantically inputting the final commands to destabilize the reactor. The air around her seemed to hum with tension, the weight of what was happening pressing down on her like a physical force. This was it, the moment everything would either end or spiral completely out of control. The reactor's hum grew louder, and she felt a surge of relief. It was working. The core was destabilizing, the fail-safe kicking in. In a matter of minutes, the reactor would reach critical mass, and the facility, along with everything inside it, would be obliterated. But it wasn't over yet. She still needed a few more seconds to complete the sequence. The massive infected creature charged forward, closing the distance with alarming speed. Rivers and his team were forced to fall back, retreating as the monstrous thing plowed through their defenses. One of the soldiers wasn't fast enough, and the creature grabbed him with its clawed hand, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. The man screamed, his voice raw with terror, but it was cut short as the infected tore him apart with a sickening crunch. Rivers fired again, aiming for the head, but the creature barely flinched. It swung one of its massive arms, sending two more soldiers crashing into the walls. They hit the ground hard, their bodies limp, and Hayes felt her stomach twist with fear. They were running out of time and out of people. Just as the creature lunged toward Rivers, the reactor console beeped, signaling that the final sequence had been activated. Hayes slammed her hand down on the emergency release, her heart racing as the reactor's countdown began. A robotic voice echoed through the room, cold and emotionless. "Warning, reactor core destabilizing. Evacuate the facility immediately." The lights flickered and the hum of the reactor grew into a deafening roar. The entire room shook, the walls trembling as the meltdown process began. Hayes stumbled back from the console, the realization hitting her like a punch to the gut. There was no turning back now. The countdown had started, and in 5 minutes, everything would be gone. "Move. We need to get out of here," Rivers shouted, motioning to the remaining soldiers. The team scrambled toward the exit, their faces pale with terror. But as they reached the door, the infected were on them. The towering creature, still dripping with blood from its previous kills, blocked their path, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger. More infected poured into the room from the corridor beyond, their grotesque forms moving with unnatural speed, their mouths twisted into expressions of mindless rage. "We're not going to make it," one of the soldiers yelled, panic rising in his voice as he fired wildly into the horde of infected. Rivers cursed under his breath, his eyes scanning the room for any possible escape route. They were trapped. The infected were closing in on all sides, and the reactor meltdown was just minutes away. Even if they managed to survive the creatures, they wouldn't survive the blast. Hayes's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. There had to be something, some way to buy them enough time to escape. But the infected were everywhere, swarming the room like a tide of death. The reactor's roar grew louder, the walls vibrating as the core continued its destabilization. It was only a matter of time before the entire facility was vaporized. Then, through the chaos, Hayes spotted something, an emergency hatch near the far end of the room. It was small, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it might be their only chance. "There!" she shouted, pointing to the hatch. "We can get out through there." Rivers followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the narrow escape route. "It's tight, but it might work. Let's move." They fought their way through the horde, Rivers and the soldiers covering Hayes as she scrambled toward the hatch. She could hear the infected right behind her, their guttural growls growing louder as they closed in. Her hands fumbled with the hatch's release mechanism, her fingers slick with sweat and blood. For a terrifying moment, she thought it was jammed, but then, with a groan of protest, the hatch swung open. "Go, go, go!" Rivers barked, pushing Hayes through the opening. She squeezed through the narrow space, the cold metal scraping against her skin as she crawled into the dimly lit tunnel beyond. Behind her, she could hear the infected clawing at the hatch, their frenzied screeches echoing in the confined space. Rivers followed close behind, his breath ragged as he pulled the hatch shut behind them, sealing the creatures out. They moved as quickly as they could through the cramped tunnel, the reactor's countdown echoing in their ears. The heat was rising, the air growing thick with the scent of burning metal as the core continued its meltdown. Every second felt like an eternity, the pressure building as they raced against time. Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel, where a rusted metal ladder led up to the surface. Hayes could see daylight filtering through a small grate above, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. "We're almost there," she gasped, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. Rivers motioned for her to climb first, keeping his weapon trained on the tunnel behind them. Hayes grabbed the rungs of the ladder and began to climb, her muscles burning with the effort. The reactor's roar was deafening now, the entire facility shaking as the core reached critical mass. They were almost out of time. As Hayes reached the top of the ladder, she pushed the grate aside and pulled herself up onto the ice-cold surface of the Antarctic wasteland. The biting wind hit her face, but she barely felt it. She was alive. They had made it, barely. Rivers emerged behind her, dragging the last of his soldiers up from the tunnel. They stood together, staring at the snow-covered landscape in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Below them, the facility groaned, the ground rumbling as the reactor's meltdown reached its peak. And then, with a sound like the earth itself tearing apart, the facility exploded. Chapter 4. The Aftermath. The explosion shattered the silence of the Antarctic wasteland. A fiery column of light erupted from the ground where the Black Star facility had been, sending a shock wave rippling across the frozen landscape. Dr. Laura Hayes and Sergeant Marcus Rivers were thrown to the ground as the earth trembled beneath them. A massive cloud of debris and smoke billowed into the air, carrying with it the remnants of the research facility that had once been their last hope of controlling the infection. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Hayes lay motionless, staring up at the vast expanse of gray sky, her body numb from the shock of the explosion. The cold air stung her lungs with every breath, but the pain felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Her ears rang, the high-pitched whine drowning out all other sounds. Slowly, her senses began to return, and she became aware of the biting cold seeping into her clothes, the rough texture of the snow beneath her, and the distant crackling of fire from what remained of the facility. She turned her head, her vision blurred, and saw Rivers lying a few feet away, struggling to push himself up. He was alive, barely. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, his eyes wide with shock. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a hoarse rasp, barely audible over the wind. Her throat felt raw, and she realized she hadn't had a drink of water in hours. She forced herself to sit up, every muscle in her body protesting the movement. The explosion had obliterated everything. Where once there had been a towering structure of steel and concrete, there was now nothing but a smoldering crater. The failsafe had worked. The reactor had detonated, vaporizing the infected, the facility, and everything else within its blast radius. It was over. The nightmare of Genesis, at least within the confines of Black Star, was finally done. But the sight of the ruins gave her little comfort. The weight of their losses hung heavily in the frigid air. So many people were dead, her colleagues, the soldiers, everyone who had been working to contain the infection. Hayes dragged herself to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. Rivers followed suit, groaning as he stood, his face twisted in pain. He clutched his side where blood seeped through the fabric of his jacket, but his eyes were focused and clear. He had the look of a man who had been through hell and survived. "Is it over?" Hayes asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rivers looked at the burning crater, his jaw clenched tightly. "The facility's gone. We did what we came to do, but that doesn't mean it's over." His words hung in the air, heavy with the grim reality that Hayes had been trying to avoid. The facility may have been destroyed, but there were still too many unknowns. Genesis was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Could it truly be wiped out so easily? Could an entity that had evolved so quickly and adapted so aggressively be so easily defeated by a single explosion? As if in response to her unspoken fears, the wind shifted, carrying with it a strange, sickly smell. It was faint, barely noticeable over the burning wreckage, but Hayes recognized it immediately. The distinctive scent of Genesis, a mixture of decay and something organic, alive. Her stomach twisted in dread. Rivers stiffened, his gaze narrowing as he caught the scent as well. "What is that?" Hayes swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "It's Genesis. I think some of it survived." The implications of her words were devastating. If even a small fragment of the infection had survived the blast, it could still spread. And there was no telling how far it had already gone. For all they knew, it could have been carried into the wind by the explosion, scattered across the ice, waiting for new hosts. "We need to get to the extraction point," Rivers said, his voice tight with urgency. "The helicopter should be waiting. We'll radio for backup and report what happened." Hayes nodded, though her heart was heavy with doubt. There was no backup, no military force, no team of scientists waiting to swoop in and fix this. The government had been clear. Black Star was a secret, and it would remain that way. If the infection spread, they were on their own. They set off through the snow, moving as quickly as their injuries would allow. The cold gnawed at them, but the adrenaline kept them going. Hayes's mind raced as they walked, trying to process everything that had happened. She had seen the infection up close, watched as it took over her colleagues, turning them into hollow, twisted versions of themselves. Genesis wasn't just a virus. It was a living organism, capable of adapting, learning, and spreading. It was intelligent in ways they hadn't even begun to understand. As they trudged through the snow, the vastness of the Antarctic wilderness stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving. The extraction point was several miles away, and the landscape around them was as desolate as ever, just an endless expanse of white, broken only by the occasional jagged ice formations that jutted up from the ground like the bones of some ancient creature long buried beneath the snow. The wind howled, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into their very bones. Rivers led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. He was limping slightly, the wound in his side slowing him down, but his determination kept him moving. Hayes followed closely behind, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she struggled to keep up. Every step was an effort, but she couldn't afford to stop. Time passed in a blur, the landscape around them shifting subtly as they made their way across the frozen expanse. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. There was no one out here but them, and the realization gnawed at Hayes's nerves. What if Genesis had already spread beyond the facility? What if the infection had reached other research stations, or worse, made its way into the atmosphere? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from beneath the ice. Hayes stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened. Rivers had heard it too. He raised his hand, signaling for silence, his eyes scanning the ground. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Hayes shook her head, her pulse racing. "I don't know. It sounded like movement." The rumbling grew louder, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Panic surged through Hayes as the ice cracked beneath her, thin lines spiderwebbing out in all directions. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Rivers grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the widening fissures. "Move," he shouted. They scrambled to higher ground, but the rumbling didn't stop. The ice buckled and groaned, and something massive stirred beneath it. Hayes's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it some kind of aftershock from the explosion? Or something worse? Without warning, the ice split open, a jagged tear in the earth that sent shards of frozen water flying into the air. Hayes shielded her face, her heart pounding in her chest as she backed away from the growing chasm. Rivers stood beside her, his weapon raised, ready for whatever might emerge from the depths below. For a moment, nothing happened. The rumbling stopped, and the only sound was the wind howling through the jagged peaks of ice. But then, slowly, something began to rise from the fissure. It was unlike anything Hayes had ever seen. A mass of twisted, pulsating tendrils, slick with a dark, oily substance that glistened in the dim light. It moved with a terrifying fluidity, as though it were more liquid than solid. The tendrils reached out, questing blindly across the ice, searching for something. Genesis. It had survived, but it was no longer confined to human hosts. It had evolved into something new, something far more dangerous. The infection was no longer bound by flesh and blood. It had merged with the environment, adapting to the harsh conditions of the Antarctic. It was spreading, growing, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything. Hayes's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. They had been too late. The explosion hadn't been enough. Genesis had survived, and now it was free. Rivers opened fire, his bullets tearing into the mass of tendrils, but it was like shooting water. The infection absorbed the impact, its form rippling but not retreating. It was as if the bullets had no effect, as if Genesis had grown beyond the need for physical bodies. It was becoming something more, a force of nature, unstoppable and insidious. "We need to go," Hayes shouted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "We can't fight it." Rivers hesitated for only a moment before lowering his weapon. "Go. Run." They turned and fled, their boots crunching through the snow as they sprinted across the frozen landscape. Behind them, the infection surged, spreading across the ice with terrifying speed. Hayes could feel it gaining on them, the air growing thick with the sickly, organic smell of Genesis. It was everywhere now, seeping into the ground, the air, the very fabric of the world around them. Panic gripped Hayes as she ran, her lungs burning from the cold and exertion. She didn't know how much farther they had to go. The extraction point was supposed to be close, but the terrain was disorienting. and the constant threat of the infection made it hard to think clearly. Every step felt like a struggle against the inevitable. And then, in the distance, she saw it, a faint shape against the white horizon, the helicopter. It was waiting for them, its rotors spinning, ready to take them away from this nightmare. But would they make it in time? Chapter 5: The End of Everything. The helicopter loomed on the horizon like a lifeline dangling over the edge of a chasm. Dr. Laura Hayes ran with every ounce of energy she had left, the bitter cold biting at her exposed skin, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. Beside her, Sergeant Marcus Rivers kept pace, his face a mask of grim determination despite the blood seeping from the wound in his side. Behind them, Genesis was spreading, an amorphous, shifting mass of tendrils, black and slick, with a nightmarish fluid that pulsed and writhed like a living creature. The infection had evolved. No longer confined to human hosts, it had broken free of its biological boundaries, merging with the environment in a way they never could have predicted. It surged across the icy expanse of the Antarctic wilderness, consuming everything in its path, leaving a trail of grotesque growths and warped ice formations that glistened in the pale sunlight. "Keep going," Rivers shouted, though his voice was hoarse from exhaustion. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hand pressed to the wound at his side to slow the bleeding. "We're almost there." Hayes didn't respond. She couldn't. Her entire focus was on putting one foot in front of the other, pushing her body past its limits as the helicopter grew larger in her vision. The roar of its engines cut through the howling wind, a beacon of salvation amidst the chaos. It hovered just above the ground, its rotors kicking up a whirlwind of snow and ice. The pilot was waiting. The door opened, but they had only seconds before Genesis caught up. The infection was fast, too fast. It spread across the ground like a living wave, tendrils reaching out with terrifying speed, latching onto anything it touched and absorbing it into the growing mass. Hayes could feel the heat from it now, an unnatural warmth radiating from the infection despite the freezing air. It was as if Genesis was becoming its own ecosystem, defying the very laws of nature. They were close, so close. The helicopter was only 100 feet away now, the pilot motioning frantically for them to hurry. Hayes's legs burned with the effort, but she pushed herself harder, adrenaline flooding her system as the tendrils of Genesis drew ever nearer. She could hear them slithering across the ice, a wet, unnatural sound that made her skin crawl. Rivers reached the helicopter first, grabbing the edge of the door and pulling himself inside. He turned and extended his hand toward Hayes, his face contorted with pain and effort. "Come on." With a final burst of energy, Hayes lunged forward, grabbing Rivers's outstretched hand. He hauled her up into the helicopter, just as the tendrils of Genesis reached the landing gear. The infection swarmed over the metal, tendrils wrapping around the skids, but the pilot was already lifting off. The helicopter rose into the air, Genesis's grasping tendrils sliding off as the rotors gained altitude. Hayes collapsed onto the floor of the helicopter, gasping for breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, her muscles screaming in protest. Rivers slumped beside her, blood staining his jacket, but his eyes were still sharp, still alive. The door slid shut, sealing them inside the relative safety of the aircraft. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Hold on, we're getting the hell out of here." The helicopter banked sharply, pulling away from the infection, which now stretched across the ice like a living, breathing organism. Hayes pulled herself up to the window, staring out at the scene below. Genesis was spreading rapidly, its tendrils snaking out in every direction, searching for new life to consume. The once pristine landscape of Antarctica was now a grotesque tapestry of black tendrils and twisted ice formations, the infection seeping into the very fabric of the world around it. "It's spreading faster than we thought," Rivers muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. Hayes nodded numbly, her mind racing to comprehend the magnitude of what they were seeing. The explosion at Black Star had done nothing to stop Genesis. If anything, it had accelerated its evolution, allowing it to break free of its human hosts and spread unchecked. They had underestimated it from the beginning, and now the consequences were unfolding before their eyes. The helicopter flew higher, gaining altitude as it sped away from the infected zone. But even as they put distance between themselves and Genesis, Hayes knew the truth. There was no escaping this. Not really. The infection had already proven it could survive the harshest conditions imaginable. What was to stop it from continuing to evolve, continuing to spread until there was nowhere left to run? "We need to warn the others," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "The infection, it's not contained. It's going to spread beyond Antarctica. We have to stop it before it reaches civilization." Rivers nodded grimly, his face pale from blood loss. "We need to contact command. They need to know what we're dealing with." But even as he said it, Hayes could see the doubt in his eyes. They both knew what was coming. Genesis wasn't just a biological weapon gone wrong, it was something far worse. Something they couldn't control, couldn't contain. It was an entity now, a force of nature, and there was no telling how far it would go. As the helicopter flew further away, Hayes felt a gnawing sense of helplessness settle in her chest. The truth was undeniable. They had lost. Genesis was no longer a lab experiment or a contained outbreak. It was out there, evolving, growing, spreading, and there was no cure, no solution. The world wasn't ready for what was coming. The radio crackled to life as the pilot made contact with the nearest base. Hayes barely listened as he relayed their situation, focusing instead on the sprawling infection below. The infection seemed to pulse and shift, as though it were alive in a way she hadn't fully understood before. It was searching, expanding, adapting. "We're running out of time," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Rivers leaned his head back against the wall of the helicopter, his eyes half closed from the pain. "We were out of time the moment Genesis escaped the lab." The rest of the flight was a blur of white snow and grim silence. The infected zone disappeared into the distance, but the dread remained, gnawing at Hayes with every mile they flew. Eventually, the outline of the forward operating base appeared on the horizon, a cluster of buildings nestled against the icy landscape, surrounded by a thin perimeter fence. It looked fragile, vulnerable, and Hayes knew it wouldn't be enough. The helicopter touched down on the makeshift helipad, the rotors kicking up clouds of snow. As soon as the door slid open, a team of medics rushed forward, pulling Rivers and Hayes from the aircraft and rushing them inside the base. The cold was quickly replaced by the sterile warmth of the medical facility, but it did nothing to ease the tension in the air. Hayes was ushered to a cot, where a medic began checking her vitals, but her mind was elsewhere. She needed to speak to command. They needed to mobilize, to prepare for the worst. Genesis wasn't going to stop. It was going to spread beyond Antarctica, beyond the frozen wasteland where it had been born. The world wasn't ready for what was coming. After what felt like hours, Hayes was led into a small briefing room, where a group of senior officers sat around a table, their faces etched with concern. Rivers was already there, sitting stiffly in a chair with a bandage wrapped around his midsection. He nodded to her as she entered, though his expression was grim. One of the officers, a grizzled man with a hard-set jaw, gestured for her to sit. "Dr. Hayes, Sergeant Rivers, we've been briefed on the situation, but we need details. What exactly are we dealing with?" Hayes took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Genesis is no longer a localized infection. It's evolved. It's spreading across the ice, consuming everything in its path. The explosion at Black Star didn't stop it. It only accelerated its growth. It's not just infecting humans anymore. It's fusing with the environment, adapting to the conditions around it. If it reaches the mainland, there will be no stopping it." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The reality of what they were facing was beginning to sink in, but Hayes could see the skepticism in their eyes. They had never seen Genesis up close, never watched it take over a human body, never felt its presence in the air. They didn't understand the gravity of the situation. "How fast is it spreading?" one of the officers asked, his voice tense. "Faster than we anticipated," Hayes replied. "It's already covered miles of the Antarctic ice sheet, and it's showing no signs of slowing down. If it reaches warmer climates, it will spread even faster. We don't know its full capabilities yet, but we do know that it's intelligent. It adapts, evolves. It's not just a virus, it's a living organism, and it's getting stronger." The room fell into a tense silence as the officers absorbed her words. Hayes could see the fear creeping into their expressions. the dawning realization that this wasn't something they could control with quarantine protocols or military might. Genesis was beyond that now. "We'll need to establish a perimeter around the infected zone," the grizzled officer said finally. "Mobilize the remaining forces, get containment measures in place." "It won't be enough," Rivers said, his voice low but firm. "We're not dealing with a regular outbreak. Genesis doesn't care about perimeters or containment. It'll spread through anything we put in its way." Hayes nodded in agreement. "We need to act fast or we'll lose control completely." Another officer, a younger man with a furrowed brow, spoke up. "If it's as bad as you say, what's the end game here? What do we do if containment fails?" Hayes felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The answer was obvious, but no one wanted to say it out loud. If containment failed, and it would, they would have no choice but to consider more drastic measures. There was no cure for Genesis, no way to reverse its effects. If it reached a global scale, there would be no saving humanity. "We have to stop it before it gets that far," Hayes said, her voice barely above a whisper. The meeting dragged on for hours, with the officers debating strategies, containment measures, and potential evacuations. But deep down, Hayes knew the truth. Genesis wasn't just a local threat anymore. It was a ticking time bomb, and there was no guarantee they could stop it in time. As the meeting finally adjourned and the officers dispersed to carry out their orders, Hayes and Rivers remained in the briefing room, staring at the map of Antarctica that had been displayed on the wall. The infected zone was already marked in red, but Hayes knew it would only grow larger with each passing day. "This is just the beginning," Rivers muttered, his eyes fixed on the map. "The world has no idea what's coming." Hayes nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of their failure. They had tried to contain Genesis, to stop it before it spread beyond the lab, but they had been too late. Now the infection was out there, evolving, adapting, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As they left the briefing room and stepped out into the cold Antarctic night, Hayes glanced up at the dark sky, her breath hanging in the air like a ghost. Somewhere out there, Genesis was growing, spreading, preparing to consume the world, and humanity was powerless to stop it. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Your time and attention mean the world to us. If you found our story captivating, we invite you to share it with your friends and family. Help us spread the word. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a moment of our adventures. Together, let's embark on more thrilling tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support fuels our passion. Thank you for being a part of our story.